The mud is thick. It is the colour of old blood, churned to paste by 10,000 boots, by the dead dragged across it, by men dying face down into it. Somewhere in the chaos, beyond the screaming, beyond the crashing bronze, beyond the awful groan of a phalanx collapsing, a Spartan king is on his knees, not in surrender, never in surrender. King Agis III of Sparta, a king from one of Sparta's two ancient royal houses, has been struck down by the Macedonians of Antipater's army, a force nearly double the size of his own. The wounds remembered by the ancient record are frontal wounds, the kind a man carries when he has been facing the enemy. His men are trying to carry him off the field. He orders them to stop. He arms himself again. And rising, slowly, painfully, near Megalopolis, Agis III raises his weapon from the ground. Think about that image for a second. The leader of the last serious Spartan bid for Greek freedom, surrounded by enemies, unable to stand, and yet he rises to his knees to face them. He kills several of them before a javelin finally mercilessly takes him. Diodorus of Sicily, writing centuries later, described it simply. He said Agis armed himself, rising to his knees, defended himself, killed some of the enemy, and was himself slain by a javelin cast. Simple words, devastating image. And when the greatest conqueror alive, Alexander the Great, thousands of miles away in Persia, finally heard about this battle, about the thousands dead on both sides, about this king who literally bled out fighting from his knees for the freedom of his people, you know what Alexander called it? A battle of mice. That is the story we're telling today. How a Spartan king staked everything on one desperate gamble against the most powerful military system of his age. How he came terrifyingly close to pulling it off, and how, in the end, his death was reduced to a footnote by the man he was trying to beat. Personally, I've been sitting with this story for a long time, and I still can't decide if it's the greatest act of defiance in Spartan history or the most heartbreaking act of futility. Maybe it's both. Maybe that's exactly the point. Let's go back to the beginning. When Agis III became king of Sparta in 338 BC, he inherited a city already halfway broken. That same year, the exact same year, the armies of Athens and Thebes were crushed by Philip II of Macedon at the Battle of Chaeronea, and with that single afternoon of violence the old Greece died. The city-states that had defined civilization for centuries, proud, quarrelsome, gloriously independent, were now corralled into Philip's Corinthian League, a political cage dressed up as an alliance. Sparta, typically, refused to join. They were excluded from it just as much as they excluded themselves. Their military reputation was still formidable enough that Philip chose not to force the issue. That decision, letting Sparta fester in its proud isolation, would have consequences nobody anticipated. Agis watched his city from the inside. He saw what Sparta had become. Once the terror of the Greek world, the nation whose name alone had been enough to silence entire assemblies, Sparta now sat on the sidelines while others dictated the fate of Greece. The humiliation of it was real, and it was daily. And Agis was not a man built for humiliation. He was from the Eurypontid royal house, one of Sparta's two great dynastic lines, the son of King Archidamus III, who had himself died fighting in Italy. The crown came to Agis soaked in loss, and from the very first days of his reign, he charted a collision course with the new order. Here is where the story gets genuinely fascinating. Because Agis didn't just decide to rebel out of wounded pride, he actually saw a strategic window open up, and he moved through it with a cold-blooded intelligence that doesn't always get the credit it deserves. Philip II was assassinated in 336 BC. His son, Alexander, barely 20 years old, took over. After securing his throne, Greece and the northern frontiers, he crossed into Asia in 334 BC, taking the cream of Macedonia's professional army with him. What he left behind in Greece was his regent, Antipater, capable, experienced, but spread dangerously thin. The Macedonian grip on Greece was real, but its enforcement mechanism had just sailed east. Honestly, when you look at the strategic situation in 333 BC, Agis's plan doesn't look crazy at all. It looks almost brilliant. In the late spring of 333 BC, the Persian admiral Pharnabazus, desperate to open a second front against Alexander, approached Agis with ships and money. Agis accepted. This was the seed of the revolt, and critically, after Alexander smashed the Persian army at the Battle of Issus later that year, roughly 8,000 Greek mercenaries who had fought for Darius III found themselves stranded, leaderless, and looking for a paymaster. Agis recruited them on the spot. Think about what that means. In the winter of 333 to 332 BC, Agis suddenly had 8,000 battle-hardened professional soldiers who had just fought in a major engagement, men who knew Macedonian tactics from the wrong end of a sarissa, men who had every reason in the world to want to hit back. He now had a core army. He had Persian funding. He had a plan. Agis didn't stop with mercenaries. He went to work on the political chessboard with remarkable energy. He sailed to Crete first. The island was strategically crucial. It sat in the middle of the eastern Mediterranean and had significant military resources. Agis reorganized the island's affairs, forced most of its cities to align with the anti-Macedonian cause, and recruited additional soldiers. This move forced Alexander to divert naval resources to the Aegean, men and ships he could not spare, to counter Agis's influence. It was a sophisticated strategic pressure campaign, not just a local revolt. Back on the Greek mainland, Agis assembled a coalition that would have been unthinkable just a few years before. The city-state of Elis joined him. Almost all of the Achaean cities of the northern Peloponnese joined him. Most of the Arcadian towns followed. This was not a Spartan revolt. This was a Peloponnesian uprising, a genuine challenge to Macedonian authority in the heart of Greece itself. The notable exceptions were painful ones. The city of Megalopolis, in the middle of Arcadia, had historically been built by Sparta's enemies specifically to contain Spartan expansion. It was an anti-Spartan city by design, and it refused to join Agis. Athens, the great champion of Greek liberty, the city whose rhetoric had never stopped calling for Greek freedom, Athens also refused. They gave excuses. They accepted money from Alexander, who tactically released some Athenian prisoners to keep their city pacified and out of the conflict. Personally, I think this is one of the most damning moments in Athenian political history, and the great orator Demosthenes, who spent his entire career thundering against Macedonian power, did virtually nothing to help the one king who actually stood up and fought. There is something deeply ugly about that silence. Agis did not wait for the perfect moment. He struck when the moment was good enough. Around 331 BC, with Antipater pinned down fighting a rebellion in Thrace to the north, Agis moved. He marched his coalition force into action and defeated a Macedonian commander named Chokehold, a visible representative of Macedonian power in the Peloponnese, in open battle. This was not a skirmish. This was a direct military defeat of a Macedonian officer in the field, the kind of victory that sent a signal to every fence-sitting Greek city-state. This rebellion has legs. This is real. Fresh from that victory, Agis laid siege to Megalopolis itself, the great anti-Spartan city in the middle of Arcadia, the one that had refused to join him. If he could take it, he controlled the central Peloponnese. He could potentially hold the entire region long enough for Antipater's distraction in Thrace to become a permanent crisis. The siege ground on, Megalopolis held. And then the news came that would change everything. Antipater had made peace with the Thracian rebels. He was free, and he was coming south with everything he had. The scale of Antipater's response was a statement in itself. He marched south with an army that Diodorus of Sicily numbers at no fewer than 40,000 men, soldiers drawn from loyal Greek allies, Macedonian troops, and northern contingents released from the Thracian campaign. It was a composite army, assembled fast and backed by money Alexander had sent west to support the campaign, and it still numbered 40,000. Agis had 20,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry, according to the most commonly cited ancient figures. Some ancient sources suggest his total force may have reached 22,000 men, when all allied contingents were counted. You have to ask yourself, what was going through his head when the scouts rode back and told him the size of what was coming? Because Agis didn't break. He didn't dissolve the coalition and surrender. He looked at the numbers, lifted the siege of Megalopolis, and made a tactician's decision. He moved his army south to a narrow pass, a constricted piece of terrain where Antipater's superior numbers would be partially negated, where the width of the battlefield would force the Macedonians to fight him on something closer to equal terms. That decision tells you everything about Agis III. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't deluded. He understood the disadvantage he was fighting from. and he adapted. He chose ground. He prepared. He intended to win. The Spartans had done this before. At Thermopylae, 300 men had held a narrow pass against the entire Persian army and bled them for days. Agis knew that story. Every Spartan knew that story. It was practically their religion. What happened next, near Megalopolis, probably in the late months of 331 BC, would either vindicate that faith or destroy it forever. The autumn of 331 BC. Two armies are moving toward each other across the Peloponnese like two stones rolling down a hill, gathering momentum with every step. Antipater's force was enormous by any standard of the era. Diodorus of Sicily gives us the number plainly, no fewer than 40,000 soldiers under the Macedonian regent's command. This was not just Macedonian veterans, it was a patchwork of power. Macedonian troops, Greek allied contingents from loyalist cities, Thessalian horsemen, and northern soldiers released after the Thracian crisis. Antipater had also received a financial injection from Alexander himself, 3,000 talents of silver to fund the expedition, which helps explain how he could support an army of that scale. This wasn't a punitive raid. It was a deliberate, fully resourced military operation designed to end the Spartan problem permanently. Facing him, Agis commanded somewhere between 20,000 and 22,000 men in total, infantry, cavalry, and allied contingents combined. Among his infantry, about half, 10,000 men, were the battle-tested Greek mercenaries who had escaped the disaster at Issus. These were not raw recruits. These were professionals who had stood in the Persian line against Alexander the Great himself, who had seen the Macedonian Sarissa phalanx up close and survived it. The other half were the allied Peloponnesian contingents, Eleans, Arcadians, the Spartan citizens, men fighting not for money, but for their homes. Agis was outnumbered nearly 2-1. He knew it, and unlike a desperate, cornered man, he responded with the cold calculation of a real commander. He chose his ground. When Antipater's massive army marched south into the Peloponnese, Agis lifted the siege of Megalopolis. He had no choice. He could not afford to have his army pinned between the city garrison behind him and Antipater's 40,000 in front. He withdrew south, scouting for terrain, looking for the place where the numbers game could be partially reset. He found it, a constricted position near Megalopolis, narrow enough to make Antipater's larger army fight on a tighter front. He would fight in a bottleneck like Leonidas at Thermopylae, and he would make the Macedonians pay for every yard. Honestly, when you understand the tactical thinking behind that choice, it completely changes how you see Agis. This isn't the story of a proud fool who charged headlong into a bigger army, because Spartans don't know how to count. This is the story of a skilled commander doing everything right within the constraints he had. He was playing a bad hand as well as it could possibly be played. The battle began with a frontal assault. There was no room for sweeping cavalry maneuvers or flanking attacks in the narrow terrain Agis had chosen. Both armies formed their phalanxes, dense, bristling walls of men, and marched straight at each other across the valley floor. On the Spartan side, the front ranks were the Spartan citizen warriors themselves, the red-cloaked hoplites who had trained for this moment since childhood. Their shield was the round hoplon, roughly 30 inches across, made of wood and bronze, heavy enough to crush a man's chest when slammed into him at a full advance pace. Their spear was the 8-foot doru. When two phalanxes collided, the result was not like a sword fight in a film. It was a grinding, crushing, suffocating mass of bronze and flesh, with men stabbing low under enemy shields, tripping, stepping over the dying, being pushed from behind by the weight of their own comrades. The noise alone, the shattering clash of shields, the shouting, the grunting, the breaking wood, would have been physically disorienting. On the Macedonian side, Antipater's front ranks were armed with the sarissa, the 18-foot pike that had revolutionized Greek warfare under Philip II. A sarissa phalanx presented not one row of spear points, but 5 overlapping rows simultaneously, a bristling wall of iron tips that could reach an enemy well before any enemy spear could reach them. Against a traditional hoplite phalanx, the sarissa was a butcher's instrument. The Spartans knew this. They had known it since Chaeronea, and they came anyway. Here is the part of this battle that nobody tells you, because the common story is that the Spartans fought hard and simply lost. End of story. That is not what happened. At one point in the battle, the Macedonian line was driven back. Read that again. Antipater's army, the 40,000-man force that had just come free from the Thracian crisis, was pushed hard enough that the front gave ground. The Spartans trusted the narrow ground. Antipater kept feeding fresh troops into the fight, and Agis drove into the pressure point with his picked men. For one extraordinary moment in the late 331 BC crisis, the battle looked like it might actually go to Sparta. Personally, this is the moment in the story that gets me every time, because you can almost feel it. The way the Spartan line surged forward, the way the Macedonians stumbled back, the way Agis must have seen the gap and pressed it. In that instant, everything he had gambled on, every calculation he had made, every alliance he had built was paying off. The dream was real. The outnumbered, outgunned Greek coalition had punched the Macedonian war machine right in the teeth. But Antipater had 40,000 men. He had reserves. Deep, deep reserves. As the Spartan charge pushed the front Macedonian ranks back, Antipater deployed his numbers like a second and third wave breaking on a beach. He stabilized the line. He rotated fresh soldiers into the front ranks, a tactic that the ancient sources describe specifically, noting that the Macedonians kept refreshing their front fighters while the Spartans and their allies were fighting continuously with no relief. The Spartan citizen warriors at the cutting edge of the assault were extraordinary fighters, but they were mortal men. They were tiring. Their arms were burning, their lungs were heaving. And Antipater had more men. The battle locked into a brutal, grinding stalemate. Neither side gaining ground, neither side breaking. The ancient sources describe it as men fighting almost one-on-one. A vicious close-quarters brawl across the valley floor, the sound of it carrying for miles. This went on not for minutes, but for hours. Wounds accumulated, men dropped, officers died plugging gaps in the line. Somewhere in the middle of this terrible attrition, the Spartan allies, the Hellenes, the Arcadians, the non-Spartan contingents, finally broke under the relentless pressure. When allied units began to give way and peel off the flanks, the cohesion of Agis's entire formation started to unravel. The Spartans themselves did not break. Not then, not yet. But the army around them was dissolving, and there is only so long even a Spartan line can hold against 40,000 men when its flanks are collapsing. It was somewhere in this phase of the battle, the grinding, terrible endgame of the engagement, that Agis III was struck down. We don't know exactly how many wounds he took, or in what sequence. What we know from Diodorus is the detail that makes the scene unforgettable. Agis fell with many wounds to the front of his body. That is the image the ancient record chose to preserve. The king of Sparta had been advancing, or holding his ground, for every remembered moment of this fight. He had not flinched in the story that survived. He had taken everything the Macedonian army threw at him while facing it directly. He was still alive, barely. His soldiers, the men still standing around him, picked him up and began carrying him back, not toward a retreat route, towards Sparta. Even in defeat, the Spartan line was falling back in order, not fleeing in rout. They were protecting their king. And that is when the Macedonians surrounded them. Right, before we get to the most extraordinary moment of this entire battle, I want to briefly mention something that I genuinely use, and that makes my research life significantly easier. If you're someone who digs deep into history like this, reading ancient sources, accessing academic databases from different countries, or just watching content that isn't always available in your region, then you need NordVPN. I use it when I'm pulling primary source material from archives that have regional restrictions, and honestly it's become one of those tools I didn't know I needed until I had it. NordVPN encrypts your connection, it's fast, it's simple to set up on literally any device, and it lets you browse freely without anyone looking over your shoulder. There's a link in the description with a special deal. Check it out. Now, back to the battle. Because what happens next is why we're all here. The Macedonians closed around the small group of Spartan soldiers carrying their fallen king. These were the final survivors of a battle that had already claimed thousands. The allied contingents were gone. The mercenaries had been broken. The Spartan line had retreated but not routed. And these few men, still armed, still fighting, were trying to bring Agis home. Agis was being carried. He couldn't stand. The wounds were too severe, the blood loss too great. But he was conscious, and when he looked up and saw that the men carrying him were going to die trying to get him out of this, he made a decision. He ordered them to put him down. Think about what that moment must have felt like. To be the man being carried, broken, bleeding, barely holding on to consciousness, and to understand with perfect clarity that your survival is costing lives you cannot afford to spend. Agis had spent 7 years trying to save his people. He had bargained with Persian admirals, built coalitions, won battles, and brought roughly 20,000 men, perhaps more when every allied contingent is counted, within a single campaign of actually threatening the Macedonian grip on Greece, and in the end the only thing he could give them was 30 more seconds of distraction. So he gave it. He told his men to retreat, to save themselves for the service of their country. Those are Diodorus' own words, preserved across 2 millennia. Save yourselves for the service of your country. What happened next, Diodorus of Sicily records simply and without embellishment. He armed himself. He rose to his knees in the mud and iron smell of that ruined battlefield near Megalopolis, and he fought. There are no details about how many men came at him first, or how long it lasted. These are details that history doesn't give us, and I'm not going to invent them. What we know is what the ancient record tells us. Agis, kneeling, fighting from the ground, killed several of the enemy soldiers before a javelin finally ended him. Diodorus records that he had reigned for 9 years, though by the dated span from his accession in 338 BC to his death near Megalopolis in 331 BC, most historians count closer to 7, a small crack in the ancient record. The death itself is not in dispute. 7 years. Or 9 if you follow Diodorus's number exactly. Either way, that is all the record gives us at the end. A reign measured in a handful of years, and a death even the historians of a conquering empire preserved with awe. You have to ask yourself what that scene looked like to the Macedonian soldiers pressing in on him. This is a man who cannot stand. He is down in the mud, covered in wounds, the army he built and led broken and retreating behind him. And he is still fighting. Not symbolically, actually fighting, killing men. The javelin that finally struck him wasn't a mercy. It was the only way to stop him. When the killing was done and the armies pulled back, the accounting began. The numbers that Diodorus gives us for the Battle of Megalopolis are staggering, even by the standards of the ancient world. More than 5,300 Spartan soldiers and allied fighters died on that field. The Spartan citizen body at this point in history was already desperately thin. Perhaps fewer than 1,000 full Spartan citizens remained, if Aristotle's grim snapshot of Sparta's manpower is close to the mark. The losses at Megalopolis were catastrophic, an entire generation of allied soldiers wiped out in a single afternoon. And Antipater's forces, for all their numerical superiority, lost 3,500 men of their own, a casualty figure that tells you exactly how hard the Spartans actually pushed them. Plutarch, in his Sayings of the Spartans, records a remarkable exchange that followed the defeat. A Spartan man named Asticratidas was asked, "What will you do now, men of Sparta? Will you be subject to the Macedonians?" And Asticratidas replied, "What? Is there any way in which Antipater can forbid us to die fighting for Sparta?" That answer, that single cold answer recorded centuries later, tells you everything about who these people were. Beaten, surrounded, their king dead on his knees in a foreign field, and they were already thinking about how to die next. Spartan resistance did not die with Agis, but it never truly recovered either. After the battle, Antipater did not simply erase Sparta. The settlement was handled through the Greek allies and then referred upward to Alexander. Sparta had to send envoys to the king. The Achaeans and Eleans were ordered to compensate Megalopolis, and Plutarch preserves a later tradition that Antipater demanded 50 Spartan boys as hostages, a demand the Spartans resisted in typical laconic fashion. The Spartan state was forced to acknowledge Macedonian supremacy in a way it had spent years refusing. But here is what Antipater did not do. He did not destroy Sparta. He did not level its buildings or scatter its people. Whether this was calculated mercy, political pragmatism, or a kind of soldier's respect for what he had faced on that field, we cannot know for certain. What we can say is that the Spartan myth, the idea of Sparta as the unconquerable, the defiant, the people who answer where when asked how many the enemy are, survived the Battle of Megalopolis, blooded, diminished, and politically neutered, but alive. Because stories like Agis's kept it alive. When news of Megalopolis finally reached Alexander the Great, he was far away in the east, deep in one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Gaugamela had broken Darius's last great field army. Babylon, Susa and Persepolis either lay open before him or already behind him, depending on the chronology you follow. From that distance in the scale of Alexander's campaign, the revolt in Greece could be made to look small, and when someone told him about the battle at Megalopolis, about the 5,300 Spartan dead, about the 3,500 Macedonian dead, about the king who fought his last battle from his knees, Alexander waved it away. He called it a Maimachia, a battle of mice. Those two words have echoed across history ever since, and they still sting. Because what Alexander meant was obvious. While the real men were out here changing the world, a bunch of provincials in the backwater of Greece had been swatting at each other. Irrelevant. Beneath notice. A footnote. But here is the brutal truth of it. The thing that I find myself coming back to every time I sit with this story. Agis III was not trying to beat Alexander in Asia. He was trying to crack Macedonian control of Greece, while Alexander was too far away to answer quickly, and he had to know the odds were ugly. Even if Antipater's army was defeated at Megalopolis, Alexander might one day come back from Persia and finish what his regent had failed to finish. The Persian funding could dry up. Athens might never truly commit. The coalition could fracture. The odds were never really on his side, and he fought anyway. He recruited, he strategized, he built alliances, he won a battle against a Macedonian commander in open field, he laid siege to a city, he chose his ground against a superior force, he drove that superior force back during the fight, and in the end he bled out from the front on his knees, ordering his men to save themselves. Alexander, who conquered Persia and Egypt and reached northwestern India, who changed the shape of the world, lived until 32 and died in a palace in Babylon, of fever or of wine, or of the accumulated weight of his own legend. History gave him the chapter, history gave Agis the footnote. But I don't think footnotes and chapters are the same thing as meaning. Agis III spent 7 years trying to give his people something worth having, and when the choice came down to his life or the lives of the men carrying him, he chose the dirt and the javelin without hesitation. You can call that a battle of mice if you want. I call it the most Spartan thing that ever happened. So that is the story of Agis III, the Spartan king who refused to submit, who built a real rebellion against the most powerful military empire of its age, and who spent the last moments of his life fighting from the ground so other men could live. If this is the kind of history that hits you, the kind that isn't about dates and dynasties but about the raw human cost of war and the decisions men make at the absolute edge of everything, then this channel is exactly where you belong. Hit that subscribe button. It is the single easiest thing you can do to make sure you never miss another story like this one. And if you really want to go deep with us, if you want early access, behind-the-scenes research notes, and the chance to vote on future battles, consider joining the Wars in History membership right here on YouTube. The link is below. Every member directly helps us make these videos deeper, better researched, and more cinematic. And if you want to keep going right now, the next video is waiting for you. We have gone deep on some of the most brutal engagements in the ancient world, battles where the outcome changed everything, and the human cost was almost beyond comprehension. You know where to find them. Stay with us. The history isn't finished yet.